Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this digital platform of the Department of English, Midnapur College. Welcome to another edition of our ongoing lecture series. And we have today amongst us the renowned academician, Professor Pablo Mukherjee. Hope you all are doing fine in this situation, though situation is not normal at all. You already know that we have been organizing online lecture series where more than 65 renowned academicians have already delivered their thoughts. So today I will try to introduce our renowned resource persons, and I consider this to be my good fortune to have the opportunity of introducing him. It's a kind of privilege I feel. It's an honor to introduce our resource persons today. Professor Pablo Mukherjee, who teaches on the English and Comparative Literary Studies program at the University of Warwick, UK. His research areas include Victorian to contemporary imperial, colonial, and anti-imperial colonial culture, post-colonial theory and literatures, crime fiction, travel writing, environment, eco-theory and literatures, science fiction, comparative, and world literary systems. Among his recent books are Natural Disaster and Victorian Imperial Culture, Fevers and Famines, got published from Pilgrim Macmillan. Another book, Combined and Uneven Development Towards a New Theory of the World Literature, got published from Liverpool University Press in 2015. And Final Frontiers, Science and Fiction and Technoscience in Non-Aligned India, again, it got published from Liverpool University. He is currently working with his WREC colleagues on a volume of keywords in world literary studies and guest editing an issue on energy humanities for review attitudes analysis. And really, we have the fortune and honor, and the Department of English, Midnapur College, feels honored to host such a academician of repute, Professor Pablo Mukherjee. So, on behalf of the Department of English, I welcome you, sir, to this online lecture series being organized by the Department of English, and thank you for accepting our invitation to address our participants online. So, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Thonmoy, and thank you for your kind introduction. Thank you also for inviting me to your series. I see several friends and colleagues have spoken already in this series, so it's good to be a part of it. Also, whoever's online, thank you for joining. It's as Thonmoy said earlier, these are tough times. But I hope you're all safe and well. So this paper is called Fossil Imprints, Energy Justice, Colonial Writing and Post-colonial Theory. And I suppose it makes one fundamental argument, which is to say that both energy humanities, of which energy justice is a part, and post-colonial theory and writing have a lot to learn from each other. I sent Thonmoy a set of slides earlier, and he will click them through as I request him to do so. This is just so that you don't fall asleep while staring at my head for a 55 minutes, however long this paper is. And if you do have any questions, of course, I'll be happy to take them right afterwards. A couple of housekeeping notes. One is my internet connection's quite temperamental at the moment. I'm in between providers, so if I blink off, don't worry, I'll come back on as soon as I can. The other thing is I do have another meeting right after this, so I'm hoping to stay for an hour and a little bit, hour and quarters, hour and a half. So I'll try and keep my paper within that range. Okay, so let me begin by invoking two seemingly different calls for justice from two literary classics of the high colonial era. In the closing, and at any moment, if you can't hear me, tell me so that I'll come closer to the screen or whatever. In the closing moments of the first act of Dinabandhu Mitra's play Nil Darpan, which some of you might know, 1861, Savitri, the wife of the Bengali gentleman farmer Golok Bosu, is forced to revise her opinions about their English overlords, and that's the first quote you have in front of you that Thonmoy has already put up. The indigo planters can do anything. then why do I hear it generally said that the Sahibs are strict in dispensing justice? Again, my son Bindu Madhab speaks much in praise of them. Therefore, I think that these are not Sahibs. No, they are the dregs, chondals of Sahibs. This play was this particular version of the play I'm reading from was translated by Michael Madhusudhan Datta. So there's an issue of the particular choices he made as a translator. We can talk about that later. I'm not going into that now. There are some striking things about Savitri's lament here, not least how Mitra codes the colonial failure to dispense justice as an affirmation of a conservative Hindu caste hierarchy. The offending Englishman can only be imagined as a lower, or more precisely, outcast Indians, Chondals. Also notable is how justice is presented as the hegemonic device par excellence of colonialism. As Savitri says, it is generally thought of as an attribute of the English, and particularly so by those belonging to the aspirational indigenous class fraction that the Basus belong to. But less visible is the relationship between the kind of work that these dregs of Englishmen are engaged in, the aggressive building of a gigantic agribusiness empire centered on the indigo plant, and the injustices that Mitra's incendiary play was written against. Think then of another moment towards the end of Rudyard Kipling's 1898 short story, The Bridge Builders. As he waits to find out whether his bridge can survive the onslaught of a suddenly flooded river, the English engineer Finlayson and his opium-perfumed dream stumbles into the court proceedings of a Hindu god, of Hindu gods and goddesses. Most of the short story happens in the second half of the short story is set in the dream world of Finlayson. The river Ganges appears as the petitioner there. And this is the second quote, Tonmoy, if you can slide down to the second slide, please. Sorry, it's the one, it should be the one before that. That's it, that's the one. That's the one with Kipling's head, that's it. That's the one, right, thanks. So that's the quote you have in front of you. They have made it too strong for me. In all this night, I've only torn away a handful of planks. It is the bridge there. The walls stand, the towers stand. They have chained my flood and my river is not free anymore. It is I, Mother Ganga, that speaks. The justice of gods. Deal me the justice of gods. Like Mitra's play, there are many striking aspects of this passage, not least of which is the neat inversion of how justice, or the lack of it, appeared in that earlier text. In Kipling's tale, it is the construction of a railway bridge, that Victorian icon of modernity, that is apparently misconceived as injustice by an antiquarian India embodied in its gods. However, in the Celestial Court's later dismissal of the river's petition, we are turned to the hegemony of justice under modern colonial regimes. That is to say, even the Hindu gods, particularly those who patronize the, quote, fat money lenders and their account books, become champions of Britain's civilizing mission. The typically complex irony deployed by Kipling, the justice of colonialism is here literally the pipe dream of a sick English engineer, serves to undermine much of what is conventionally seen as a simple allegory of the white man's burden. But again, what tends to pass unnoticed is the issue that lies at the heart of Ganga's petition, that it is the containment of her aquatic energy by the railway bridge, which is of course itself a conduit of the fossilized energy of coal, which is at issue here. So in what follows, I will offer some preliminary speculations about the relationship between the kinds of justice and forms of energy that is, in fact, widely represented in colonial and post-colonial writing. I will offer some reasons for the relatively recent critical and academic engagement with this, and then I'll try and outline what both post-colonial theory and what has recently been called energy humanities stand to gain from such an engagement. So in the next section, I look at the conversation between post-colonial theory and environmental and energy justice. Written in the wake of the invasion and occupation of Iraq by the US-led Allied forces, Neil Lazarus and Priyambada Gopal pointed out in 2006 the paradox, thanks Tanmay, paradox this cataclysm posed to post-colonial studies. And that's the quote that Tanmay has just put up in front of you. What we are proposing is that after Iraq, post-colonial studies must change not because the world has changed, but because Iraq shows that in quite substantial ways it has not changed. This sounds paradoxical, of course. Why should post-colonial studies have to change, and if and indeed because the world has not changed? The answer to this question is that up until now, post-colonial studies, in its predominant aspect at least, has demonstrated a notable disregard of what Kanishka Gunawardhane and Stefan Keffa call the contemporaneity of imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism, that is, of the deep structural dimensions of the world system. Such perspectival lacuna, they suggest, they being Priya Gopal and Neil Lazarus here, they suggested was the result of the historical condition of this academic field, marked simultaneously by the fading of the insurgent energies of the anti-colonial national liberation movements of the Bandung era and the demise of Soviet socialism. Such epochal transformations in turn gave rise to the misconception, particularly amongst the professional Euro-American academics, that all resistance to the now triumphant status quo of the Washington Consensus was not only futile, but decisively over. Therefore, Lazarus and Gopal argued that in order to remain constitutionally, I'm quoting them here, constitutionally a politically progressive intellectual field, post-colonial studies would have to embrace a body of work that registers the actuality of the world system and the structuring effects of this system and work towards a new history of the present, a new reading above all of the 20th century, liberated from the dead weight either of a Cold War or of a compensatory third worldism. Such calls for making post-colonial studies more rigorously historical materialist are of course not new. Yet Gopal and Lazarus's use of Iraq as a conjuncture in the Gramscian sense in relation to post-colonial studies seems to me to be appropriate insofar it introduced a new paradigm to the field, new that is in 2006, to the field which may be summarized by a single word: energy. We have by now become accustomed to thinking about Iraq as an oil war. The evidence for this hypothesis has been amply provided both within the domain of mass media, famously by luminaries such as the American Republican Senator Chuck Hagel and the former chair of the US Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, as well as in that of scholarly analysis. In this sense, therefore, as Gopal and Lazarus suggest, Iraq appears merely as a single link in the long historical process of the forcible appropriation of resources on a massive scale that we call imperialism and colonialism. But again, it may be that the specific nature of this resource, oil, compels us to reconsider not only how we think of empires and colonies, but also what we thought we knew about energy and its role in such historical formations and processes. For while oil is now acknowledged as the fuel without which what we think of as modernity would not have come to pass, at least not in its current configuration, it is also the case that the central role it has played in the geoatmospheric event we now call climate change urges us to think not only of the social relationships conditioned by the use of this or that resource, but of the much deeper histories of energy, climate, and empire altogether. For example, to talk of Iraq is, of course, to talk about injustice. The myriad slogans and banners raised in the famous Million People March in London on February 15th, 2003, which remains to date the largest political demonstration in Britain, against the invasion of the country quite explicitly linked the appropriation of oil to a corresponding lack or scarcity of justice in the context of the global neo-imperial dispensation. But using this common sense to build theoretical or conceptual or analytical tools has proved to be no easy task. What kinds of justices do various energy forms demand? Conversely, do all kinds of energies give rise to ideas or practice of justice? Are access and affordability of energy adequate frameworks for thinking about justice? Such questions have entered academia, and then again only some corners of it, very recently. If Heffron and Macaulay in their 2017 study are correct, energy justice first appeared as a term in research literature in 2010, and it was not before 2013 that it began to receive serious consideration. This lag between a popular consciousness about the relationship between energy and justice and conceptual and theoretical considerations of them may in fact speak of a general difficulty about what we might call energy imaginary. This scalar difference, as well as symbiosis between particular forms of energy, the larger energy system as such, and the cultures and lived experiences of the longue durée of historical epochs lie precisely at the heart of what Alan McDuffie calls the material and representational dimensions of the current energy problem. For McDuffie, the failure to differentiate between energy as, quote, usable resource and as an ambient agency circulating endlessly through the world can, in the final instance, be located in the 19th century, and in particular the pivotal figure of Robert Malthus, whose idea of a closed system of a, quote, single inescapable world environment should be seen as one of the most durable interpretative frames deployed over the past 2 centuries. The Malthusian imagination, which should properly be thought of as environmental, is classically anthropocentric, since it conceptualizes energy primarily as a system running on fossil fuels and servicing a particular mode of production, capitalism, which in turn supports human social relations marked by growth, consumption, and inequality. It proceeds analogically insofar that all the other ways of life are subordinated to this logic. Although McDuffie prefers urban industrial logic as a conceptual term in his explanation of Robert Malthus's work, it is clear that what he's talking about here is what Mark Fisher much more recently called capitalist realism, the imperative to subjugate in imagination and practice all Lebenswelt in the interest not of humans as such, but humans of a particular kind, Homo economicus. If such a concept of the world as a closed energy system is co-productive of modern capitalism, the field of energy humanities is conceived of as a serious and decisive challenge to it. One of the signal achievements of energy humanities has been to deepen Fernand Braudel's great insight about modernity's longue durée by suggesting that various forms of overlapping, interlocking, and contradictory energy regimes as periodizing devices of such a duration. As Imre Zeman and Dominic Boyer put it in their foundational anthology of energy humanities, to be modern is to depend on the capacities and abilities generated by energy. We are the citizens and subjects of fossil fuels through and through, whether we know it or not. To think of energy, therefore, is also to think of the intertwined histories of capital and empire, not as an exercise in nostalgia, but in order to shape a different future. I think this is on the next slide, Tonmoy. The way one establishes epochs or defines historical periods inevitably shapes how one imagines the direction of that the future will take. This probably is the next one. That's the one. And so it is with the dominant periodization of the history of capital, which has been organized primarily around moments of hegemonic economic imperium. What if we were to think of the history of capital, this is one of the quotes in front of you, not exclusively in geopolitical terms, but in terms of the forms of energy available to it at any given moment? One of the things that happen when we reorder the history of capitalist modernity thus is that it makes the reordering of other kinds of other periodizations, such as literary history, imaginable. A few years before Zeman, Patricia Jaeger made exactly this suggestion. Instead of divvying up literary works into 100-year intervals or categories harnessing the history of ideas, what happens if we sort texts according to the energy sources that made them possible? If reordering periodization thus can be thought of as one of the first achievements of energy humanities, a second has been to restore the question of labor or work to a position of central importance to any understanding of capitalist modernity. Strictly speaking, this has been the contribution primarily of those scholars and theorists associated with the world ecology paradigm and the various challenges mounted by others to this. Consider the very definition of world ecology as proposed by Moore, Jason Moore, the fundamental co-production of earth-moving, idea-making, and power-creating across a geographical layer of human experience. It is impossible to sustain this concept without also considering the determining role played by work or energy in it. Work/energy helps us to rethink capitalism as a set of relations through which the capacity to do work by human and extra-human natures is transformed into value understood as socially necessary labor time. This is a quote that might be up on the next slide, Tonmoy, that from Jason Moore's work, 2015. World ecology then reveals work energy as the mediating device that draws all human and non-human life forms into a particular kind of social relationship marked by the twin forces of appropriation and exploitation. Such an understanding of energy as work then leads to the third insight gained by energy humanities, an expansive and sophisticated theory of social power. Andreas Malm notes that despite the semantic confluence of the Anglophone world, thermodynamic and social power, he's obviously focusing on the word power here, are nearly always treated as a distinct phenomenon. Whereas in reality, no piece of coal or drop of oil has yet turned itself into fuel, and no humans have yet engaged in systematic large-scale extraction of either to satisfy subsistence needs. Fossil fuels necessitate waged or forced labor, the power of some to direct the labor of others as conditions of their very existence. We should direct our attention to power in the dual sense, first of all in the processes of labor. This conception of social power turns conventional accounts of the history of industrialization on its head. The familiar story of Industrial Revolution, for example, tends to privilege technological determinism, where scientific entrepreneurs such as James Watt appear to respond to solve the structural crises brought about by a scarcity of resources with their inventions and thereby chart out a new pathway to, quote, growth. But as Malm's meticulous study of transition from water to steam power in Britain shows, this flies in the face of all available evidence. British industry, and in particular British cotton industry, did not suffer from a scarcity of water or rise in cost of setting up water mills. Rather, the switch from water to steam or from flow to stock in Malm's vocabulary happened because it better served the interests of the capitalists as a class over that of the British workers. Tonmai, that's the next slide, if you have it in front of you. The new components of flow energy, like running water, light, and wind, are res communes because they are difficult to appropriate for individual use. Stock energy, such as coal and oil, on the other hand, are piecemeal, splintered, amenable to concentration and accumulation, and divisible, and therefore congenial to the logic of private property. This is Malm speaking. It is this material logic contained in the stock energy form rather than any techno-scientific invention that made its fusion with the social logic of British industrial capitalism both possible and desirable. The third insight of energy humanities is that social power is always composed of different kinds of energy resources and that such energy resources are always already socialized. In the case of capitalism, commodities are produced for exchange value only by increasing the rate at which biophysical resources are appropriated. Fossil fuel or stock energy becomes historically indispensable in this process and should properly be thought of as fossil capital, a triangular relationship between capital, labor, and a certain segment of extra-human nature, and a process, an endless flow of successive valorization of values at every stage claiming a larger body of fossil energy to burn. Again, this is on a slide 6, Tonmoy, if you have it in front of you. So periodization, labor, or work, power, it is not hard to see how each of these concepts, re-energized as it were, can be valuable for post-colonial studies primed to ask the right questions and wrestle for some appropriate answers in an epoch defined by the interlinked crises of climate, capital, and world hegemony. But so far, any consideration of justice has been rather muted among energy humanists. To a large extent, this may be because of the work of conceptually distinguishing energy justice from the longer established environmental justice. So that's the next section. I distinguish between the two. Is ongoing. It is also the case that arguments about energy justice have tended to, for institutional and disciplinary reasons, have circulate outside the usual reaches of humanities scholarship in the pages of journals such as Energy Policy, Environmental Justice, and Ecological Economics. But surely this is all the more reason to integrate justice as one of the core issues of any scholarly inquiry that marches behind the banner of energy humanities. Surveying the impact of already decades-old environmental justice movements, so in this section I distinguish between the two kinds of debates about justice. Environmental justice movement in 1999, David Schlossberg pointed out that the justice demanded is really threefold and begins with two central issues: inequity in the distribution of environmental risk and recognition of the diversity of the participants and experiences in the environmental justice movement. This integration of the distributional equity and recognition comes in the form of demand for more public participation in the development, implementation, and oversight of environmental policy. The movement argues that procedural equity is a way to address both distribution and recognition. Schlossberg was critical of the organization of this movement, particularly in the US, which he saw as racially and economically homogeneous and privileging the possession of resources or wealth as the basis of their activism. But this is not entirely accurate. As Adamson, Evans, and Stein's landmark collection from 2002 shows, much of the environmental justice movement, EJM, was in fact activated against global corporatism, the mass protests against WTO meetings in Seattle, Toronto, Genoa, etc., alive to the racial dimensions of environmental inequities. For example, the 1987 report on racial justice by the United Church of Christ Commission in the US, and able to deploy acute analysis of capitalism and colonialism in environmental degradation. Neera Jain may be closer to the mark when she suggests that struggles for environmental justice do not only involve integrating distributional, procedural, and recognition justice, but are also about, quote, ways of knowing, being, valuing. That is, epistemological, ontological, and cognitive justices. Without these latter, for example, it is difficult to see how we can demand sacrifices such as degrowth economic policies from those nations and societies disproportionately located in the global north that have hitherto benefited from the forcible crafting of sacrifice zones in much of the rest of the world. Energy justice thus grows on the ground turned over by environmental justice movement, but also seeks to open fresh channels in it. One key difference between the two is that energy justice tries to frame itself in relation to both the producers and consumers of commodities in the modern world system. An energy just world would be one that promotes happiness. I think this is the slide in front of you. Promotes happiness, welfare, freedom, equity, and due process for both producers and consumers. It would distribute the environmental and social hazards associated with energy production and use without discrimination. On the one hand, such attempts to see the dynamics of the modern world relationally, involving both producers and consumers, try to address the pitfalls of addressing the issues of injustice and justice from one corner of the social field dominated by consumption. On the other hand, in attempting to treat all actants equally, it ignores the already existing unevenness of power relations between them, one that, for instance, is recognized by the demands of degrowth sacrifices as reparations. The enmeshing of the principles of procedure, distribution, and recognition also allows energy justice scholars to shift the problems of efficiency from economic to ethical terms, such as virtue. This is what Sovokol and Dworkin do in that essay I'm citing there. Thus, everything from human rights abuses to faulty environmental impact assessment and energy poverty are rejected on deontological grounds, rather than because of their possible consequences. Another difference between energy and environmental justice is the latter's attempt to break free of what may be called the proximity bias of the former. The classic environmental justice movement builds upward and outward from the local and regional levels to those of the national and international, to global or worldly. It is at its strongest in organizational, conceptual, theoretical, and activist terms, at its core, where specific events of environmental degradation are located. In contrast, by taking vulnerability and capacity as its guiding frames, energy justice tries to move in the reverse direction, from the global and the worldly to the local and regional levels in a systemic and relational manner. One additional distinction between the two lies in the way in which breaks or transitions, historic and otherwise, are accorded primacy by energy justice scholars thinking about the problems of temporality and periodization of energy regimes. This focus on breaks result in conceptual primacy of discontinuity and incommensurability rather than that of assumed continuity and homogeneity of or between eras. Energy justice scholars argue that this attention to the disjunctive relationality between historical times have resulted in the incorporation of the principle of restorative justice, where the primary aim is to, in future, repair the harm done to an individual or communities in the past, rather than punishing the perpetrators, as well as identifying where and when prevention needs to occur. By taking this detour among the circuits of energy humanities and energy justice, I do not mean to suggest that post-colonial studies can simply and opportunistically recharge itself by plugging into them. Rather, it seems to me that the fields are bound by certain elective affinities that orient them towards excavating a history of the present, as Gopal and Lazarus put it in their 2006 call. Indeed, it would be accurate to say that it is precisely the question of justice, as I had hinted in the opening moments of this discussion, that defines one of the strongest binding agents between post-colonial studies, energy humanities, and energy justice. In his recent magisterial account of British colonialism and imperialism in India, Shumit Sarkar shows how every layer and mode of their life worlds, economic, social, cultural, etc., had the questions of injustice coded into it. Macroeconomic policies such as excises on the Indian cotton were not determined by the passionless mechanisms of the world market, but by the results of the determined and corrupt campaigning by the Manchester cotton lobby to push Indian cotton growers and textile manufacturers out of the market and convert large numbers of them into exploited laborers in British businesses in the subcontinent. Bureaucratic exercises apparently designed for efficient governance, such as the landmark census data pioneered by Risley, this practice is still carried on by Indian government today, produced social classifications such as criminal tribes, which in turn created pools of semi-servile labor for the benefit of property holders, both foreign and Indian. Legal measures, in particular, such as the Landmark Forest Acts of 1865 and 1878, were explicitly designed to cut off whole swathes of non-sedentary or semi-settled rural Indians from any access to livelihood and justice. The British aim of turning Indian forests into zones of commercial monoculture delegitimized entire ways of life at a stroke of a pen. Collecting wood for fuel, grazing, and slash-and-burn agriculture became criminal activities. Indigo and tea plantation in particular attracted measures such as the Indenture Act of 1865 that widened the already considerable gap between law and justice. After 1865, for example, the European tea planters in Assam were given powers of summary arrests and did not require legal warrants from magistrates to capture their indentured workers trying to flee conditions of massive mortality rates comparable to, and in some cases exceeding, the American slaveholding states of the South. Shumit Sarkar's findings sum up the works of generations of scholars who have excavated the fundamental and necessary question of injustice as a determining or structural principle of modern colonialism and imperialism at all levels of operation. But despite their meticulous attention to the question of justice and to the ways in which this was posed in relation to economic, social, and cultural lives of the colonial and imperial subjects, such scholars have not necessarily raised it in relation to the kinds of energy dispensed by these lives. It is here that a synthesis, or at least a conversation between post-colonial studies, energy, and environmental justice can both underline the affinities between them, as well as allow each of the fields to make some new analytical gestures. The two texts I opened my remarks with, Neil Dorpon and Bridge Builders, are familiar to those affiliated with post-colonial studies, but reading them together as specific registrations of colonial and imperial energy regimes, may allow us to approach the questions of justice in new, defamiliarized manner. Such will be my concluding suggestions here. So that's about 35 minutes. I'll try and wrap this up in 10 or 15 minutes in the final section. In one sense, we can clearly gather both texts under the rubric of what Tabish Khair has in another context called Babu fiction. That is, they dramatize the affinities and competitions across racial lines between men who are simultaneously privileged and dominated, and who put forth their claims to be what Tithi Bhattacharya has felicitously called sentinels of culture. What is interesting that for Mitra and Kipling both, such claims of hegemony are made through the twin language of justice and energy. Ranajit Guha shrewdly notes about Neel Darpan that at the time of its publication, Mitra was, quote, one of those young men who managed to have some bad prose and worse verse in Shongbat Prabhakar between 1853 and 56. That the play itself received indifferent critical reception, that the topic was hardly a revelation, and yet a luminary like Shibnath Shastri could pronounce that Mitra's play had spoken for their generation. Guha's explanation is that it is only when the indigo planters decided to sue the play for libel that the literati of Calcutta, both Indian and European, decided to rally behind it, and in the process turned the text into a, quote, pretext for the fabrication of a nice little middle-class myth about a liberal government, a kind-hearted Christian priest, a great but impoverished poet, and a rich intellectual who was also a pillar of society. A veritable league of power and piety and poetry, standing up in defense of the poor riot. Coming when it did, this myth did more than all to comfort a Bhadralok conscience, unable to reconcile a borrowed ideal of liberty with a sense of its own helplessness and cowardice in the face of a peasant revolt. I think this quote, Ranjit Guha's quote, might be in the next slide, Tonmoy. That is, it is the legal context of the performance and countervailing vision. So I think it might be the one after that that has the photo of Shibnath Shastri and so on. That is, it is the legal context of the performance and the countervailing. Sorry, if you go back one and one more. Yeah, I think. Yeah, so that's a map of the indigo districts, and the quote follows that. That is the legal context of the performance and the countervailing vision of justice offered by the play that its post-colonial reputation rests on. That is, it is the legal context of the performance and the countervailing vision of justice offered by the play that its post-colonial reputation rests on. Neel Darpan's Bhadralok credentials are paraded immediately in a series of prefatory remarks before the action begins. The real risk of pauperizing the Bengal riot, a peasant proprietor to the condition of a serf, we hear, is that it dooms imperial efforts to, quote, develop the resources of India. Queen Victoria is imagined as, quote, the mother of the people who has now taken them on her lap to nourish them, and dispatched many, quote, great men who will very soon take hold of the rod of justice in order to stop the suffering which the riots or the peasants are enduring from the great giant Rahu, the indigo planter. But such anti-radical reassurances are secured in the play through a staging of the conflict between the metabolic imperatives of animate power, that is labor, or human labor largely in the play, and that of waterborne flow, energy harnessed to the interests of colonial capital. The indigo plant is the source of blue dye still used extensively in cotton textiles, such as the jeans some of you might be wearing. And as Guha and Sarkar have both argued, the Indigo Rebellion of 1860 that affected the districts in the map that is up on your slide was in response to a constellation of national and international crises. A slump in the London indigo prices, the Union Bank crash in Calcutta, the consequent squeeze put on the more modest planters by the sector's big beasts, which meant those are the districts, indigo growing districts of Bengal, central and northern Bengal, and most of the indigo revolts were concentrated there, which meant that the cultivators increasingly were increasingly terrorized into growing a crop that was economically unviable for them. Like other tropical plants, indigo thrives in relatively high soil temperatures, around 18 to 20 degrees, and high volumes of water is required for washing away any residual salinity. If planted as a cash crop alongside a food crop like rice, which of course is the dominant food crop in the areas that you're seeing, it can then lead to a competition for energy flows, mainly water, to the detriment of the latter. In Mitra's play, the global crisis of falling profit rates in colonial agribusiness can only be shown through a specific local conjuncture, where soil, water, air, and other forms of flow energy are directed away from the subsistence needs of the cultivators to the planter's profit imperative. Hunger, therefore, appears as the most recognizable sign of this energy rupture. Golok Chandra Basu laments in the opening moments of the play, Shorapur, quote, is not a place where people are in want. It has rice, peas, oil, molasses, vegetables in the field, and fish from the tanks, whose heart is not torn when obliged to leave this place. We are therefore given to understand that the scarcity which compels the big and small riots to migrate from Shorapur is engineered by loans forced on them by the European planters in order to divert their land and labor to indigo cultivation. Hunger also affects people disproportionately. It is much more acute for tenant farmers like Sadhucharan or Torapa than for the landowners like Golok Basu and his family. The latter's claim to gentlemanliness in the play, of Bhadralok, they're Bhadralok farmers, in the play is secured not only, as Guha rightly argues, through the possession by the men of a certain amount of cultural capital, for example, the ability to access colonial law courts, their familiarity with Shakespeare, whose work in translation is cited by Bindu Madhav, one of Golok's sons, in his letters to his father, but also via their voluntary subjection to the affliction of starvation. That is, energy deprivation, in solidarity with their tenant farmers. Bindu Madhav underscores this in the third act of the play when he explains that the Basu family has, quote, other ways of living. The loss of indigo for 1 year or two might stop feasts and religious ceremonies, but they will not produce want of food. But this is not an option for the smaller farmers or riots. They risk a confrontation with the planters' wood and rose. When Golok loses his court case and is jailed, he fasts for 4 days before committing suicide. His death brings the riots to the brink of insurgency. But the moral fiber of the gentleman, the Bengali gentleman, requires their refusal to turn their self-sacrifice into a trigger for radical action. 200 riots with clubs in their hands are crying aloud, I told them to go to their houses, since if the Sahib gets the least excuse, he will burn the whole village. This is Bindu Madhav speaking. Thus, Mitra's Bhadralok farmers accrue what Ranajit Guha calls the borrowed ideals of liberty through a conflict between flow, water, and animate energy forms, labor. But we can go a little further than this. What is often overlooked in the discussions of Mitra's play is how sexuality and religion are integrated within this matrix of interplay between energy forms, not only to indigenize liberalism, so the Bengali Bhadralok becomes a liberal farmer or a liberal subject, but also to recast it in a conservative, specifically Hindu mold. The play's outrage lies not only in the planters' unjust appropriation of the Basu's lands for the cultivation of indigo, but also in their encroaching upon their sexual claims of the indigenous patriarchs of the Basu family on their women, and thereby redirecting the flow of social and sexual reproduction away from its designated task. Such appropriations are not only seen as unjust, they're also coded in terms of dishonor. Quote, what honor remains to us now? The planter has prepared his places of cultivation round about the water tank. In that case, our women will be entirely excluded from the tank. This dishonoring of indigenous patriarchy culminates in the rape of women like Khetramoni, who dutifully interprets her violation as an assault not against herself, but against her husband. The sufferings of Khetramoni after her rape is likened to that of stillbirth or abortion, and her final anguished plea is to be turned on her bed to be by my father's side. The play itself ends with the figure of Shabitri, Gokul's widow, cradling the dead body of her eldest son Nobin while attempting in vain to force her breasts onto his mouth. Bindu, her surviving son, arrives to find another dead body, that of Nobin's widow Shorolota, who has been killed by Shabitri. As the mother, quote, having destroyed the child whom she was fondling for making it sleep on her lap, on awakening will go to destroy herself, so wilt thou. The injustice of the indigo plantation system is then shown in the socially and materially reproductive energies of land, water, and women. Honor in the play is not just gendered, but also communalized, not only because it is drawn in contrast to European women, such as the planters' wives, but also because it is Muslim men like Amin, who, as the planters' agents, are directly responsible for its violation. Drawing on the hoariest and crudest Islamophobic stereotypes, Mitra draws Amin as a corrupter of the proper channels of animate sexual energy. He has served his own sister up to his master's pleasure in order to further his career, and his very body is seen as anathema to Hindu sensibilities. Quote, "Oh, the beard, when he speaks, it is like a he-goat twisting about its mouth, fie, fie, the bad smell of onions." He is, quote, "the degenerate who is instrumental in Khetramoni's rape, the force who is ruining the country, to the extent that his religious marker, Musulman, is used as a term of abuse amongst Hindu riots." Amin's graphic violence against peasants is of a piece with his sexual violence against their women. He is the other against which the moral credentials of a Hindu liberal order and of a liberal ordering of energy are secured by Mitra. Written nearly 4 decades after Mitra's play, Kipling's Bridge Builders is often and correctly read as a paradigm of a muscular imperialism that presents work or labor, in particular men's work, as the rays of empire. But comparing it to Mitra's play and keeping in mind some of the interpretative protocols of energy humanities, we may be able to offer a slightly more refined conclusion. That for Kipling, true justice is only realized through material labor or work, that this labor or work is racialized and gendered insofar that only some, that is to say white European, men are able to properly perform it, while it behoves upon others, non-white and non-European men, to follow the example of the former, and that this idealized brotherhood is achieved by the balancing out of the forces of flow and stock energies, which brought about by a judicious use of animate power. The story begins with the engineer Finlayson's sovereign survey of the imminent completion of his good work, the great Kashi Bridge, being thrown across the river Ganga. Such work demands simultaneously the mastery of the aquatic forces of the river, the entropic drag of state bureaucracy and tropical diseases, and the animate power of the colonized humans and beasts under his charge. Generally, the latter cannot, that is to say, the beasts cannot be distinguished from the former, the humans. The one, quote, crawling, climbing out of the yawning borrow pit below, the other by the hundred swarmed about the side of the lattice work. But there is an exception, the foreman of the Indian laborers, Peru, who is a Lascar, familiar with every port from Rockhampton and London, and who, after rising to the rank of a serang on the British India boats, had wearied of the work discipline there and thrown up his service and gone inland. Peru's familiarity with the flow of the sea, his expertise with tackle and handling of heavy weights, the authority he wields over the laborers in the name of honor, make him not only an invaluable assistant to British engineers Finlayson and Hitchcock, but virtually the co-author of their civilizing mission. Kipling serves this liberal assumption of qualified and fairly precarious equality with an expert dose of irony. When Finlayson smiles paternalistically at Peru's proprietorial behavior towards the bridge, the readers are invited to smile back at the Englishman's easy assumption of racial superiority through accounts of Peru's heroism that saved the girder, quote, saved the girder of number 7 pier from destruction, when the new wire jammed in the eye of the crane and the huge plates tilted in its slings. Peru's instinct for water compels him to warn Finlayson that the river is bound to react unfavorably to being, quote, bitted and bridled by the bridge, since she is not like the sea that can beat against the soft beach. The engineer is skeptical, since Peru offers this insight in the distinctly non-secular language of Hindu cosmogony. The bridge, from his point of view, is meant to undergird the secular triumph of fossil or stock energy, steam railways, over that of the flow of the Ganges. For Finlayson, the railway bridge also stands for militarized imperial order, quote, loophole for musketry and piers for big guns, and signifies the pakka or permanent nature of empire. But it's Peru's instincts that proves to be superior. The bridge challenges Mother Ganga, but when she talks, I know whose voice will be the loudest. When unseasonal rainfall upstream results in a flood that threatens the bridge and along with, quote, the honor of imperial work. As was the case in Mitra's play, honor here is a key component both of patriarchy and of justice. Peru urges his workmen to, quote, fight the river hard, for it is thus that a woman wears herself out, end quote. And even as the flood threatens the destruction of countless Indian lives and property, it is his own honor that Finlayson is most worried about. Quote, Mother Ganga would carry his honor to the sea with the other raffle. Government might listen perhaps, but his own kind would judge him by his bridge, as that stood or fell. At this critical juncture in the tussle between the flow of the river and the stock of the railway bridge, a particular kind of indigenized animate power intervenes. As the exhausted workers watch the flood water creep up the bridge, Peru offers some opium pellets to Finlayson, which he claims are, quote, meat and good toddy together, and they kill all weariness, besides the fever that follows the rain. I have eaten nothing else at all, clean Malwa opium. Much like indigo, opium was a key imperial cash crop, insofar profits accrued from its exports from India, most famously to China, of course, hence the Opium Wars, were essential for maintaining a favorable balance of trade and geopolitical power, and its cultivation diverted massive amounts of land, water, and labor that would otherwise been expended on subsistence agriculture. In making it the drug of choice of the Indian laborers who use it to fend off the effects of their depleting metabolic reserves, because they're made to work night and day on the bridge, caused by a lack of food, as well as that of the English engineer who dulls with it the anxiety caused by his impending loss of honor, Kipling reveals an uncannily accurate picture of both political and the energy unconscious of modern imperialism. For, with a striking flick of narrative switch, the ingestion of opium famously takes us from a realist to what Michael Lowy calls a critically realist register. Instead of firing up his capacity to keep up his vigilant work on the bridge, the opium activates a dream work in Finlayson, which holds the key to solving the standoff between empire's flow and stock energies. Finlayson's opium dream is that of the Hindu gods. I talked about this in the beginning of the paper. Hindu gods debating the fate of the bridge, and by extension that of British Empire in India. When Ganges, in the shape of a crocodile, complains about the bridge builders taming her, she is answered by Ganesh and Shiv that the coal-powered railways that had ushered in the era of the, quote, fat moneylenders, since all the towns are drawn together by the fire carriage and money comes and goes swiftly and the account books grow fat as myself. On the one hand, this dream work justifies empire through the hegemony of a class fraction. It is assumed that what is good for the fat money lenders is good for everyone. On the other hand, it reverses or at least modifies Finlayson's hitherto militarized vision of imperial work. No musketry loops or gun ports here disturb the steady accumulation of wealth. It falls to Krishna, one of the original Hindu trinity, to pronounce judgment on the epochal nature of stock energy that drives the railways. And this is the final slide that Tanmoy has. Great kings, the beginning of the end is born already. The fire carriages shout the names of new gods that are not old under new names. Drink now and eat greatly. Bathe your faces in the smoke of the altars before they grow cold. As men count time, the end is far off. But as who know reckon, it is today. The peace between the flow of the Ganges and the stock of the railway bridge is brought about by opium-fueled metabolic surge in the animate power of imperial workers. This balancing act between the material forces of empire is replicated in its ideological domain. If Finlayson enters the non-secular world of Peru through opium smoke, Peru travels in the reverse direction as Finlayson emerges from his reverie. He relates to the Englishman what his near-death experience during a sea storm on board an English ship has taught him. If I lose hold, this is Peru speaking, if I lose hold, I die. And for me, neither the Rewa, the name of the ship, nor my place by the galley where the rice is cooked, nor Bombay, nor Calcutta, nor even London will be any more for me. How shall I be sure, I said, that the gods to whom I pray will abide at all? Peru's work on the English steamship in this respect confirms the judgment of Krishna that Finlayson witnesses. It is just, both deontologically and consequentially. So post-colonial scholarship usually reads Kipling and Mitra in oppositional terms, as some of you will know, one as an arch-imperialist and the other as a radical nationalist. But by paying attention to how they registered the various forms of energy that charged the everyday life of empire, we can detect the currents of mutual interest that bound them almost despite themselves. Their investment in a specific, even peculiar kind of justice, class-bound, gender and race-inflected, and marked by a temporary and precarious masculine fellowship, if not equality, makes visible the contradictions that ran through every level of a modern capitalist imperialism and colonialism. It also alerts us to the fact that liberalism and authoritarianism can have at its core similar understandings of justice to activate their own respective claims to world order. Such approaches may help us think about post-colonial studies in a new key for an era that is hotly tipped to finally signal the end of the Capitalocene. So thank you. That's the paper that has been around 55 minutes, like I said. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, if you had any questions, I'd be happy to reply them.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful presentation, and what an oratory! How convincing, enticing, engaging, resourceful in true senses of the terms. Really, it was an enumerative, wonderful, exhaustive session, and I truly believe that our audience is taking much away from this lecture. Very informative session it was. That the content was rich and dense, which will take time to percolate. Now it's time for the questions or the any queries if the audience have, so they can drop them down in the comment section of YouTube and Facebook. Then I will bring them out to you. So I can see that there are a few questions right now.
So this is a question by Debobroto Adhikari. The Nil Revolution portray a straightforward historical depiction of indigenous protests against the British oppression, or are there other sides to it? So as I was trying to hint in Ranajit Guha's reading of certainly Nil Dorpon, there are clearly many other sides to it, because Nil Dorpon as a play does not, in Guha's judgment, and I think he's right in this, does not accurately portray the actually existing historical Nil Dorpon revolts, or at least the various dimensions of it. What it does is it tries to move the play, that is, it tries to reincorporate the popular and agrarian dimensions of the revolt into aesthetic terms that are legible to the middle classes, both indigenous and British, because let's not forget that Nil Dorpon also attracted a lot of sympathetic notices from the British intelligentsia. So I guess what the reason I bring Nil Dorpon here up here is not because it's a historically accurate depiction of Nil Bidroho, but rather because it provides a particular way of entering that debate through the theatrical form or dramatological form that was conducive for its consumption and understanding, both in Calcutta, which is distant, relatively speaking, from the locations of the Indigo Revolt districts, and globally, because this becomes known globally as the play, much like Uncle Tom's Cabin in the context of American slavery, as the play that challenges it. Actually, as Ranajit Guha argues in a very early essay, this is an essay from the mid-1970s, Dino Dinabandhu Mitra shares a lot of the assumptions about justice in particular of the British colonial ruling classes that the play is putatively written against.
So, as I said, it's the time for questions or observation or a query, or if you have any thoughts to share, so you can drop them down in the comment section. I'm there to bring them out, so you can do it quickly. So, these are the few observations, sir, made by the participants.
That's a comment from my sister-in-law. So hello, Bhumika.
Oh, okay. Oh, so yes, there are more comments from. So this is
Yeah,
again
she's
question
just
from.
teasing me.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I can see another question: the relationship between energy humanities and environmental humanities.
Yes.
So that was it's from SK Tarakali. I was trying to argue that energy humanities grows out of environmental humanities. But it also extends the scope of its inquiry. So in the paper itself, I argue, and this is generally what I argue in other parts of my work as well. So in the paper itself, I suggest that there are three ways in which energy humanities extends the scope of environmental humanities. First is it tries to approach the question of justice both from the side of the consumers and the producers, whereas energy humanities, environmental humanities usually focus on the question of consumption rather than of production. The second difference is it moves away from what people call the proximity bias of environmental humanities, which is classically in environmental humanities, the question of justice arises out of local incidents. So that could be an example of a local pollution or a polluter. Oil spills is a classic example, etc. Whereas energy humanities it's not so much that it's not interested in local questions of injustice, but it approaches that from the other end. That is to say, because it talks about it thinks about justice as a universal practice. It tries to approach the local from the global or the worldly end of the scale. Finally, energy humanities thinks of historical transitions, particularly between the regimes of energy resources, for example, between wood and coal and oil, marked both simultaneously by by breaks and incommensurabilities, as well as their continuities. So environmental humanities largely sees or is more comfortable in talking about longer durations that are more or less homogeneous globally, whereas energy humanities, because it pays attention to particular modes of energy that dominate a particular regime, it talks about it thinks about the relationship between those regimes relationally as well as in terms of their differences. So those three ways, I think there's obviously more work to be done on this, but those three ways it extends or departs from the classic energy environmental humanities paradigm. Shoykot Chakraborty has a question about energy justice and planned thinking. I'm not very familiar with Marder's work. I know it very superficially, mostly through critical plant studies. I think the trajectory of energy justice and critical plant studies in terms of its intellectual formations are quite different. In fact, the volume that I'm currently editing about energy justice has a couple of essays on that draws on critical plant studies, etc. So it's not that they can't be run together, but I think energy humanities, energy justice certainly, but energy humanities in particular, were formed out of a historical materialist formation or tradition of thinking and analysis. Plant studies or critical plant studies grow out of a slightly different intellectual tradition, more akin to the first wave of first generation of environmental theory, North American environmental theory, and so on. So there, my sense is, not knowing perhaps as you do Marder's and others' work, I know an overview of critical plant studies. My sense is that their formations and the way they think about issues of temporality, world systems, and so on. World systems is not a term, for example, that critical plant studies recognize. The philosophical origins and theoretical origins of critical plant studies and plant thinking, etc., are mostly in the non-human or more than human tradition that comes down largely from the work of Bruno Latour and others, the kind of actor network theory people. So they're very different to the energy justice scholars. This is not to say there cannot be any conversation between them, but so far my sense is they operate from different theoretical and political formations, and there is not much actually conversation between them. The recent chapter in Andres Mom's book, The Progress of the Storm, Mom has a whole chapter on this different formations, so that might be interesting for you to look at.
So Dada, may I take one more question?
Yes,
and then we will end the session.
Yes.
Two questions actually. It's information by Tariq Ali, my friend.
Yes.
Tariq. See, yes, some books on energy humanities.
Yeah.
Actually, his research area is in this.
Yes. So hi Tariq. The books, I mean, as I say, it's a recent field. It's coming out. Imre Zeman's book and Dominic Boyer has an anthology. It's simply called The Energy Humanities, that collects all the essays, or what they see as the important essays of the last, I suppose, 10 or so years, less than 10 years. So that's a good place to start. If you know that already, if you don't know that already, that's a good place to start. Dominic Boyer also has a separate book on energy politics. That's quite good. Andres Malm's book, both the books on fossil capital and The Progress of the Storm, that's also good. The work of the After Oil group with Graham MacDonald, again Imre Zeman, and so on. That's handy to look at in terms of fossil fuel and the energy debate. So I said there are about maybe sort of 10 or 12 titles. I'm happy to send them to you by email if that's better. Shekhar has a question. Shekhar Jakat has a question about electricity. It absolutely does. I don't look at it in this paper, but there is quite interesting work actually. One of my friends and colleagues have done some work on electrification and modernization in Japan, and and modernist literary formations there. So you might be interested in looking at that. There's quite a lot of good work on the electricity debates or the electricity wars between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison, and their relationship with American modernism, particularly in the poetry of Whitman. That's pretty good. Enda Duffy has a great essay on the electrification of Dublin and Ireland, and the formation of the Irish and Scottish Gothic genre. So it's absolutely electricity is absolutely a good a genre to think of in terms of electrification, light, etc. Or couple of genres. One is the supernatural or the ghost stories. And the other one is crime fiction. Both of them give the interplay between electric light and the electrification of modern cities, and its relationship with darkness. That is at the heart of both those genres. So electricity absolutely comes under the domain of energy. It's not something I look at it here, but very interesting work is being done. So thank you for the question. Again, if you email me, I'll say there's about 10 or 15 or 20 essays. If you email me, I'll be happy to send them to you.
Yes, thank you, sir. We will end the session right here.
Thanks so much. Thank
And
you.
Thank you very much for giving us this precious time out of squeezing out of your busy schedule.
No
So
worries.
we
Thank you for
know.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dada.
All right. Okay. See you later.